Today, I'm honored to welcome my colleague Andrea Bonime-Blanc. Andrea is the founder and CEO of GEC Risk Advisory, specializing in the governance and risk oversight of change, including technology, geopolitics, sustainability, and leadership trust for businesses, NGOs, and governments worldwide. She's also a former C-suite executive at companies like Bertelsmann and PSEG. She has over 2 decades of experience leading legal, compliance, ethics, corporate responsibility, and risk functions. She's a globally recognized thought leader, keynote speaker, and the author of several books, including Gloom to Boom, How Leaders Transform Risk into Resilience and Value, and The Artificial Intelligence Imperative. Her next book, to be published by Georgetown University Press in late 2025, is called Governing Pandora, Leading in the Age of Generative AI and Exponential Technology. Andrea was born and raised in Germany and Spain, and now she lives in New York City. In my discussion with global leaders, I never settle for the obvious. What is written in a resume tells only part of the story, but what truly shapes leadership and corporate integrity is the human. Today, we explore the unseen factors that influence decision-making, risk, and resilience at the top, together with Andrea. Let's dive into Andrea's insight and also focusing on her new book, which will be published very soon.
In today's complex business environment, leaders need not only to be prepared for the worst, but also to build their resilience. At The Human Factor, Corporate Integrity Matters' Sonia Sterneman invites top executives, board members, and industry experts to reflect and talk about the realities of corporate integrity, risk, and ethical leadership. As an international governance authority, independent director, and entrepreneur, she understands the challenges leaders face. Integrity and ethical leadership are not just principles. They build resilience, enhance reputation, and create strategic competitive advantage for organizations and for individuals.
So let's dive into Andrea's insight when it comes to the question of ethical leadership and corporate integrity, and also focusing on her new book, which will be published, I think, late of December or autumn. I'm not really sure. So I'm so honored to have you here, Andrea, and let's get started. And honestly, I'm so curious about your new book, and I would like to start with that, even though this was not our initial plan. So I hope you're flexible enough, and let us start with that. Is that okay for you?
That is fabulous, Sonia, and thank you so much for having me here. And, I'm pre-promoting my book in the sense that it's not really ready, but the topics are very current. Let's put it that way.
That's also what I think, because you just gave me a few insights. I haven't read all of it right now, but I would like to know what drove you to write that book with that content right now. I think it wasn't written right now, but when did you start thinking about the content?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking, Sonia. I've been writing short articles about the governance of technology for a few years now. And in fact, my previous book, I talked about ESG plus technology. So I talked about this whole concept of ESG plus T and how we need to govern it and manage it in a connected way. So I continued to write several articles over the last few years. And I wrote one for NACD Directorship Magazine in the summer of 2023. So about a year and a half ago. And it was called The Governance of Exponential Technology, Opening the Pandora's Box, something like that. And a publisher that I was familiar with who had moved to Georgetown University Press reached out to me after she saw the article, and she said, "Would you like to write a book about this?" And this was the fall of 2023. And I first said, no way, I'm not writing another book. But then I became infected by the idea. So I put the proposal together, wrote it in most of 2024, and now it's in production and all the finalization stages. But the purpose is really looking forward. How do we as decision makers, managers, board members, policymakers, how do we deal with this tsunami of new technology, of the risks and opportunities, all this crazy stuff that's going on? How do we do it in a rational way if that's possible? So that's the sort of the impetus of the book, so to speak.
By then, 1.5 years back, you haven't had an idea what happens right now, isn't it? And if I just hear what you are saying right now, and I really hope maybe you are allowed also to give us the link of this or this specific article that we can also link that in our show notes, because I think also our audience, I think as long as they have to wait for your book right now, they would like to read the article first. And we discussed it already in our pre-discussion, saying, hey, what's going on right now all over the world with all our challenges we have, I think that book couldn't be more relevant.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll be delighted to provide links. And, in addition to the governance of technology, which is the focus of this book, it's really put in the larger context of what I call our global megatrends that are like multi-year, huge sort of changes that are taking place in the world. And of course, socioecology, climate is one of them. Geopolitics clearly is one of them. Technology, leadership trust is another one, as far as I'm concerned. And then we have also changes to how we deal with capitalism, how ESG and sustainability intersect. So I have these 5 megatrends that I write about and speak about every year, looking forward for a year or two. And so combining those sort of big megatrends with the governance of technology was really what I was doing in the book, but I was really thinking about these larger trends too. And of course, here we are with what I wouldn't call seismic change, but seismic ruptures taking place from a geopolitical standpoint. So that's sort of emerged in a huge way in the last few months.
When I hear you now, what kind of megatrends you are following, when I just, step back a little bit, at the end, it all goes back to governance and corporate integrity, isn't it? Because we are all humans and we all face now these kind of megatrends. And at the end, it's really the behavior and the leadership style and our role modeling we also we use every day, which counts most to manage these kind of changes we have right now.
Sonia, you and I come from the same place when it comes to thinking about these things and the work that we've done to, separately. We didn't know each other at the time, but you've been doing work in leadership, trust, and ethics, and I've been doing that. And if there's one thread that runs through all of my work, and I'm sure yours as well, is this idea that if you don't have the right leaders in place who have the high integrity, that understand the interconnection between being responsible and ethical when it comes to business, when it comes to new technology, when it comes to dealing with human rights and other types of important issues that business people are constantly facing. If you don't have those sort of thoughtful leaders that know how to connect integrity with action, everything else falls apart. And we're seeing that in a geopolitical large scale as well.
What do you see? Because I really I'm curious what your opinion on perspective is about that. All the regulations, all what we have to deliver as leaders, everything increased over the last years, maybe 5 years. But now I think also the pace is even faster than 2 years ago. What do you see? How did these kind of leadership behaviors when it comes to integrity change during the last 2 to 3 years?
Well, I think the pace and pressure and impact of change is making it harder for leaders to pause and think about, is this the ethical way to go? Because the pressures of other businesses, of competition, of global competition, we have the EU, which is more advanced from a regulatory standpoint when it comes to the technology and the privacy and the data issues. And then we have the US, which is largely unregulated, except for a couple of states that take it seriously. And that was 2 and 3 and 4 years ago. Now it's even less serious about regulation. In fact, the few things that we had in place in the US to think about AI and think about responsible AI, ethical AI, are being dismantled as we speak by the new administration. And so we have, and then we have the 7 biggest technology companies in the world doing amazing things, but not necessarily with any real guardrails, unless the leadership of the company says we need to have guardrails. But the pressure of the competition, not only within the US technology sphere, but from the Chinese companies and EU as well, is a competitor. And then the pros and cons of how do we do business in Europe when we're an American company that doesn't want guardrails. I mean, these are really big big issues. And at the same time, I think your point at the beginning of that question is spot on. Nobody wants guardrails. They just want to go off and do their thing. And whatever happens will happen. And I have a bad feeling that's going to be the case. Whatever happens will happen.
And that's exactly what you said. We don't need to have these guardrails, but we need to have leaders with integrity. You know what I mean? I think at the end, if maybe that's just a big question and maybe also too philosophically, but we would need to have all these kind of regulations if people would behave with enough integrity and ethical leadership. But at the moment, we have these kind of differences between the countries. That's for sure. How do we make sure that people are not yet panicking? Because that's also what I can see in some jurisdictions right now. Because it's not a, how should I say, it's not an easy path some of the countries are going right now. But on the other hand, we want to work together. That's also what you said. How do we make sure that we still work together in a way which is also, how should I say, supporting our society and the world?
I think that's the key actually to maintaining a certain amount of voluntary, codes of conduct, if that's what you want to call it, or ethical principles, responsible principles. The big businesses, whether they're in the US or Europe or China, and I'll speak more for US and Europe because I'm more familiar with those parts of the world, but the big companies have a social license to operate. And that includes making sure that they treat their stakeholders as well as possible. And that means keeping your employees happy and not putting them on projects where they feel that their ethical standards are being compromised. And we've seen a variety of companies where leaders have come out and they've basically said, I don't want to work on this because we're not respecting the human rights of the people who are looking at the terrible data that's, on social media, for example. And so the leaders of these companies have to be sensitive to their most important stakeholders. And I think that's a guardrail, right? And they want to keep their employees happy. They want to keep their customers happy. They don't necessarily want to create litigation situations and other kinds of bad reputation situations. So those are kind of pressures that are built into society, but they're not very good because there are a lot of companies that are just doing whatever they want to do.
That's true. But also when you said, I think we all understand, and we all hope that these kind of leaders are all over these places of large organizations, but often we also see the opposite. What kind of blind spots do you think we all have, especially when it comes to board members or management teams, about integrity? Do you have some kind of examples also in the work you do, supporting and also advising large operations, exactly when it comes to these kind of topics?
Yeah, I think we all have, just by virtue of being human beings, we all have blind spots about ourselves. We think we're ethical. We think we have high integrity. We think we're good people. And I'm reminded by my husband once in a while that I'm not perfect.
Really?
And so even if you think you're all those things, you have blind spots. You will not see certain things. And I know for a fact that, I've caught myself frequently not wanting to see bad things when they're right there. And so we want to protect ourselves and our brains from trauma and from, terrible things. Like, I'll give you a very quick example. I'm watching much less news. I'm reading news, but I'm watching much less news because the visuals stay in my brain and don't let me sleep. And so we all have these behavioral things that we do to protect ourselves and maybe protect our family and others from some of the real downsides. There's some serious. So the blind spots are not admitting that things are as bad as they are, potentially. And also, denying others their opinion or their take on things and not listening carefully enough. And I think that happens too much at the highest levels of organizations, whether it's the boardroom, but it's mainly at the management level. They don't want to hear bad news until the bad news slaps them in the face. And so you don't put in the processes and the people and the guardrails needed to protect the organization, create the resilience that will allow the treatment of shocks and crises in a more rational way. So I think blind spots are, we don't want bad news. We don't want to think about risk. We think we're great people. And that applies to leadership. It applies to board. I mean, the board is even more disconnected. So the board takes in good faith what management tells them and frequently doesn't go deeper. And that's one of the biggest blind spots of boards.
But I also think, when you as a board member, for example, you have a different perspective, which is also good because you are not so close to the business, and you also see some kind of other businesses, maybe other boards you serve, or maybe just the other profession you have next to it. And what I often see is, that the management team, it's quite difficult for them also to, maybe it's easy to listen, but not to digest what the board is telling them, because it's sometimes hard. And as you said, we don't want to hear that right now because we still believe that it's not as bad as it really is. And that's what you now also said before. So how can we make sure that our risk landscape, for example, is complete? Because also when we go back to the pandemic, people now tell us that it was a black swan. It wasn't, because it was obvious. It was on each report. But as long as it is not here, we just can't believe that. And I think that's really one of our blind spots we all have. And the more we talk about it, and the more we also learn from others that we have these kind of blind spots, I think the more complete our risk landscape and also our ability to adapt to this kind of crisis increase, and also the resilience at the end.
Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of been my life's work, is understanding the risks that are applicable, understanding how you triangulate them, and then understanding how you can create a greater value for your organization and your products and services potentially if you understand those risks. And it starts with those really big mega risks, right? What the World Economic Forum does every year with the Global Risks Report, which to me is my Bible of global strategic risk. I look at it every year.
Mine too, even though we are not sitting. Yeah, but it's so interesting, for the last 10 years, for example, it's also my Bible, and clients don't want to listen to it. And when something happens, they just come and say, okay, we know it was already under the 10 biggest risks. I said, yes, it was. And I think it's interesting that also we are not sitting in the same country, but we all use that kind of report. And that's also important, that people think about what kind of resources or sources could I get to make sure that I have a big picture or even more overall picture to my potential risks. And when I go back to to some of the organizations that just don't do that because they are sticking within their industry, maybe even with their geographical environment, but they don't want to go beyond that.
And that's one of the biggest blind spots of the organization, right? Is not being able to understand and digest that you live in a world that is turbulent. You have a supply chain, you have customers, you have ingredients that are, all over the place. And I don't care, people used to say in the past, oh, if you're a utility in the US, you don't really have a supply chain. You don't have any international issues. Excuse me, you have many international issues. You happen to have most of your assets sitting in the US, but you have supply chains, you have software, you have all kinds of things that are international. And so we need to understand where we are in the world, our footprint, our supply chain, our customers, our stakeholders, and understand the risks involved with that. And if the last few years between the pandemic and the change of regimes that we're experiencing right now in the US, which is throwing alliances up in the air, wars in Europe, and tensions between China and Taiwan, and serious issues and wars in Africa with climate implications and immigration implications. If we're not thinking about risk right now, excuse me very much, but you deserve not to succeed. Is my point.
So, but I think people also organizations, they do not do that because they don't want to. You know what I mean? But they are not trained or maybe not used to think that far. I think you're sitting in the US. I'm sitting in Switzerland here, and when I look around, and I think people here, they exactly know that they are in a position which is much better than maybe all other places all over the world. But it's also a risk, as long as we are sitting here and not facing all these risks immediately. I think sometimes I'm not sure whether organizations are as fast as they should be when it comes to the adaptation. And it could go very, very fast. But we are not used to that. We are not trained. Our DNA is not yet trained to these kind of risks.
Mm-hmm. I agree. There was a gentleman who was a professor at Wharton, I think business school, many, many years ago. I can't remember his name, but he did a lot of studies on risk and risk behaviors. And something I took away from that particular talk was human beings are not designed to incorporate long-term risk into their brains. They don't want to. And I understand that. You happen to be people who actually have sensitivity and interest in those areas naturally. Maybe we were born that way. Maybe we had experiences, we had experiences that made us that way. I can speak for myself. And so we have crisis and risk management sort of built into our outlook. And so we will look at those longer term trends. But then there are no excuses within companies and organizations and boards to not have people like you and me in the leadership team or on the board who can help others who don't naturally think that way navigate through this, right?
Absolutely. But, it's really exactly what you said. I think we are not born with that, but we just had these kind of, how should I say, experiences which made us to have that kind of radar.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
For bigger risks, and maybe also the foresight for these kind of risks. And sometimes I can also understand that maybe you, or at least me, we are also nightmares because we can smell the risks. I have no problem with risk. I also like this kind of risk, but I like to know them. And that's exactly why I also like to talk about them, because I feel much more protected and safer and I know exactly what kind of risk could really happen and also occur in one kind of more negative impact than the others, because at the end risk is, has an upside and a downside. But now we are talking about the negative risks. And I think exactly what you said, we need to have people at the table having that kind of radar and just listening. Maybe it's at the moment not really, how should I say, feasible for most of them. But they will remember that we already discussed it years or months ago that it could happen. And I don't know how we could also make sure that it's more, how should I say, interesting to talk about risk, because talking about risk is not a risk already.
No.
But I think some people fear about talking about risk because they think, okay, then it's going to happen. And that's not true.
No. And in fact, I've spent a ton of years thinking about this topic of how do we make risk more appealing?
Exactly, more sexy,
More sexy, exactly. But I found the solution, and the solution, and it doesn't always work, but I think it's a good way to look at it. And I think it's based on facts and data. And that is when you know your risks well, meaning you understand the causation, you understand the factors, the criteria, everything that you need to know, you can then understand how to create more resilience. So through a crisis management plan, business continuity, cybersecurity, whatever, and you can build in more value because you can create more valuable products and services. Because, for example, if you're a software company, you build in some resilience, some protections into your software so that it doesn't get messed with. It's harder to cyber attack, et cetera, et cetera. So there is value creation opportunity in every risk. And so that's my little.
Absolutely. And what I try, I also, the return on investment, also when we talk to shareholders or stakeholders, I think when you manage your risks, your resilience is increasing and you have a higher return on investment. And with that, you have your competitive advantage. Also, when it comes to having people or having the best people, behaving like that, managing your risks and being aware of that, it's really a success factor at the end. Even though it cannot be manifested right now, but as soon as people understand that that's what you said, facts and data is necessary. And also when you compare what it costs, when you're not covering or managing the risks, it often helps. Absolutely. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. You and I are in violent agreement with each other, Sonia.
Okay. But now I think then we should really switch to something I cannot have the same opinion because I never experienced that. No, what our audience always likes to understand, if you are willing to talk about it, has there been moments in your professional life when your own personal integrity was under pressure? And maybe, I think it's also hard to talk about it, but maybe also maybe if you cannot go back to that, what was the feeling? Because sharing that kind of feeling or experience also helps others and maybe also younger listeners to feel not alone during that kind of process.
Well, I can guarantee all our young listeners and anybody else who wants to listen that we are not alone, that these unfortunate pressures at work, especially we're thinking about the work context here, but these kinds of pressures are always there. And it takes a lot of intestinal fortitude on your part to resist temptation, let's say, or to look the other way. And I think it goes back to what kind of a human being are you? Are you one who cares and has empathy, or are you one who is more narcissistic and focused on your own gain? And so I think it starts a little bit with that, but it also continues with understanding the long-term implications of if you do something that isn't correct or right, or it's unethical or irresponsible, you will live with those consequences both internally in your own brain, but also potentially reputationally as a person that then is less attractive to your existing employer or to future employers. And so, yes, I have faced a couple of very serious situations where my job was on the line, and I was acting as a chief ethics and compliance officer. And since I acted as that in all of the companies I worked for, you can identify which ones I'm talking about. But in one case, I was able to navigate successfully an allegation that was made, but it took a lot of fortitude and making sure I reached the right people to protect me within the organization of an accusation by a high-level person who was not correct in any way. So that was resolved, but it was a couple of months of high anxiety, put it that way.
I can imagine.
Because this is your job. It's not just your job to be the ethics and compliance person that's available to everybody else to help. It was my job to make sure that I didn't cave. And this person was trying to get rid of me, basically, was what happened. They were trying to get rid of me because they actually had some issues. But that's another story. But I was protected because there were higher level people who were able to protect me. And in another case, it led to my, go ahead.
Just because I think that's super important, you were protected. And I think that's really important also for our listeners. Not always you have that situation that you are protected, and then you are really alone and have to make the decisions for yourself, for your future, and maybe also for your family.
Exactly. And my other case, I wasn't protected at all, despite my attempts. And rather than cave to the situation, which I could have easily done, I left. So that was a very, very difficult situation for me because I'm the breadwinner of my family, and we're employed. We don't want to be unemployed, especially if we're breadwinners. And so that was an extraordinarily difficult period in my life. But I was the phoenix rose from the ashes, so to speak. And years later, I was able to have a successful business. So, at the end of the day, you have to stick to your integrity, your personal integrity, because that's all you've got at the end of the day for your own peace of mind and for the ability to be employed in the future and respected by others in the future. So I'll just throw those two examples out, one where I was protected and one where I wasn't, and I suffered quite a bit, but I was able to come out on the other side, rising from the ashes, as they say.
So thank you very, very much for sharing, because I think it's so important that you also have these both examples. I just had one example, which was the one being unprotected, and I exactly know what kind of hassle it is. And at the end, when you stick to your own integrity, your own values, I think at the end it really pays out. Not in money, but really in your own way and your own how you would like to live and what you see, what is important in life and also in business life. So thank you very much for sharing. Yeah, I think it's important also and interesting also for our listeners to hear that from real people, not only reading from other books, because I think you are really a role model, and thank you very much for sharing. But now, I don't want to finish here right now, because I think you also have to share something with us. What would be your advice or your hope now for the future, for maybe the next 6 to 12 months when it comes to integrity, ethical leadership, but also the challenges we all face?
Yeah, I think we are we're being tested in a way that I don't think we have, although the pandemic was a sneak preview. And that was I'm being a little bit humorous, but it obviously was not a humorous, it was a very serious and nasty situation all over the world. So I think we need to stick to our values, stick to our worldview, learn, educate ourselves, while not indulging in some of the really bad news that is out there. So try to keep yourself sane in the way that makes you feel better, do things that you love to do. I, for example, walk every day for 5 miles to clear the mind and get out into the park and see some birds. So do something that helps you stay sane. Really, really pay attention to your sources of information. Do not go on the internet and listen and see anything and everything. Pick your sources of information that you know are reliable and that are giving you the information. Don't get swayed by ideological warfare and misinformation. So I think that is a really important piece of the puzzle right now. But stick to your inner voices of rationality, values, and we will navigate through this time. It's going to be a very tough one, but I'm an optimist at heart, even though I've been very tested recently. But there you go. Those are my thoughts.
So thank you very much. It's such a beautiful closing. Thank you very, very, very much for first your time and also your insights that you shared, all that. Also, I think also really personal insight with us. And I'm really sure, and I hope this was not the last one we had together. Maybe we can also record another one because I'm sure our audience will love it. And I wish you all the best. And I think you are one of the best navigator also for these kind of times we are now facing all over the world. And I'm looking forward for the next occasion we can also get together virtually, but maybe also in Switzerland or in the US. So thank you very much.
That would be wonderful, Sonia. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to your audience for listening.
This was another episode of The Human Factor Corporate Integrity Matters with one of my highly appreciated guests. Today it was my appreciated colleague Andrea Bonime-Blanc, where we uncover the leadership strategies that define governance, risk and resilience, guided by the principle corporate integrity is the foundation of trust, resilience and long-term success. Thank you for listening. I'm Sonja Stirnemann, your host. Stay aware, act decisively and lead with integrity. Take care and have a good time.